Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Donna Welch, Assistant Superintendent for Administrative Services for the Huron Valley Schools. Today, I'd like to give a little budget update for the district and our future projections for the fiscal year 11-12 school year. We follow a budget process which has a number of different steps involved. First is to develop a preliminary budget projections, and then we inform and gather a variety of stakeholders on our budget. From there, we gather information and develop recommendations from the stakeholders related to the budget. We then discuss those recommendations with impacted stakeholders, ultimately getting to the point of approving the budget by the end of June. We are required by the state of Michigan to have a balanced approved budget by June 30th, and at this point we are prepared the first week in June to approve the budget for the fiscal year 11-12 school year. So that first step, which was developing the preliminary budget projections, there are a number of steps within that we like to follow. First off, we always look at the last year results of operations to determine how did we end the year? Did we end the year with overages or underages, and what do we need to do to adjust that, if anything, related to the budget? So first thing is looking at last year's results of operations. From there, we also review prior year budget reduction and additions or suggestions that were made last year that we did not incorporate into the current budget process. We also gather information from the state and taxing authorities and healthcare providers, because these are all external influences that impact our budget. The state impacting our foundation allowance, the taxing authorities impacting our millage rate for our special education funding, and then healthcare providers also have their changes which impact our budget as well. Then we get to preparing our preliminary budget forecast. So the first step is looking at the last year's results of operations, and this slide shows the final budget to actual for the general fund. And as you can see, revenues were very close to budget and actual. There's about a $300,000 difference between revenue, budget to actual, and about $1 million difference with expenditures, but $600,000 of that was related to a timing difference, which we refer to as encumbrances, where an order has taken place prior to the end of the year, but we have not actually expensed that, and you'll see that in the next slide as well, that we haven't expensed that until the next year. So that's just a timing difference. It's not an actual underspent of the budget. So there was a net change of about $300,000 for revenue, $400,000 for expenditures, and the next slide details that out a little bit more for us. So with revenue, we did receive a little bit more in Medicaid outreach funding than we had anticipated. Also, you may recall that the legislators did decide to give us back about $11 per pupil from the original $165 per pupil reduction or takeaway that they had agreed to do for the 9-10 school year. So rather than have $165 proration, we decreased by $154 per pupil. So that was a little bit, those changes and a little bit with some transportation reimbursement made up the $300,000 difference in revenue. Now that shows that we budgeted very accurately with revenue, within 0.3% of what we anticipated for revenue to what we actually received. Similarly with expenditures, there's really two main areas that made our expenditures a little bit different. One, as I mentioned, was the textbooks. We did do a textbook adoption in the spring, and we didn't actually purchase or receive those books until July, so there was a timing difference related to the textbook purchases. The other piece was the fact that we had a mild winter and we spent less on utilities. So that was about $400,000. Now we analyzed last year's expenditures to see, is this a trend that we expect? Will we continue to have less utility expenditures, or is this a timing difference? And as you can see with expenditures, these were timing differences. We did have a more snowy winter, a longer winter this year, and therefore that's not something that we can assume that we'll have less utilities going forward unless we do other energy improvement areas, which we do. So we were within about 1.2% of the budget to actual for expenditures. Now this slide shows our budget allocated by the different areas within the general fund. Our primary area of operation is instruction, and we spend about 77% of our budget on instruction related areas. The next area is maintenance and operations, which also includes utilities. So it's about 11% in total and 3% allocated for utilities. Our next area is transportation, and one thing to note with that is it's about $5.3 million, but in the past few years it's been as much as $7.5 million. So we've really done some efforts there to try to streamline our operations from transportation. Another area is other support, and this slide notes what those other support areas are, which includes technology, pupil accounting, businesses and purchasing, communications and human resource services, so kind of everything but the instructional area, the maintenance and transportation. Then we also have an area for athletics. A general fund does subsidize the athletic program by a little over $800,000 a year, and again, that is a reduction from past years. Then with a very little part of the general fund budget going to capital outlay. This is because we do have dedicated funds for the building and site sinking fund and our bond fund for transportation and buses, which allows us to purchase those items and is dedicated for those areas. So very little capital outlay comes from the general fund. This also shows last year's operations by function, and so it's pictorially how do we spend the money as a function related item. Well, our largest area is salary with slightly under $50 million. I will note that in past years our salaries were over $50 million, but through, again, looking at areas to streamline and also operate with less personnel, we have reduced that area. Benefits is an area which includes our state mandated retirement system, the FICA tax, or the Social Security tax that's required for us as an employer to pay, as well as health care and a few other areas of benefits. Then the other areas would be purchase services and supplies. Primarily that's going to be your areas of utilities and other areas that you might be purchasing support for. And then transfers would include the area of athletics primarily. And then you have capital outlay and a few other areas that make up the rest of the general fund budget. We have made a lot of reductions over the years, and since 2003-2004, for the general fund alone, we have made over $22 million worth of reductions, and this is shown here by category of whether they are by instruction or by transportation or by maintenance and operations. And including then athletics and food service, we have made over $23 million worth of reductions since 2003-2004. And when you look at the two columns for the 9-10 and then going into the current year, we're in a 10-11 school year, you can see where we've really had to increase the amount of reductions we've made because our expenditures have increased, as well as us receiving or prorations or reductions in state aid has caused us to have to make more reductions to balance our budget as required by the state. The next slide then is a part of the budget process. So once we've analyzed what we've done in the past years, look to talk about what we've done, we then say, okay, what are the changes from last year to this year? And this slide and the next slide will summarize what those changes are related to the budget. So for revenue changes, we're actually looking at a foundation reduction from last year to this year of $4.7 million. Now this is based off of the current proposed budget proposal from the governor and could change once the House or the state have their versions of the budget proposed. But right now, there's about a $470 per pupil proration for all schools, K through 12 public schools, and that amounts for our district of about $4.7 million. We are also still anticipating a loss of students for next year, and that equates to about $1.2 million because our funding is based on the amount of students that we serve. We are also expecting a loss of special education millage, and I referred to that earlier when our special education millage is based on the rates, or the millage rates in Oakland County, and we have seen reductions over the years related to the economy, and so that nets to about $1.1 million less in special education millage money that we expect from for the next fiscal year that we're currently receiving for this year. And then finally, the other change that we're going to see with revenues is the loss of federal stimulus money, or ARRA grant monies, and we're expecting that again to go away. That was only one-time money to help districts get through temporarily to balance their budgets, and so that will also not be available for us for the next year. So that amounts to about $7.3 million in budget revenue reductions from last year to this year that we must incorporate into our budget process for next year. Now this slide also shows the expenditure changes that we are also focused on. We do have automatic step and lane increases that change from year to year with some of our employee groups, and that amounts to about $700,000 change. Healthcare increases, we anticipate impact to our budget of about $1.1 million. The retirement rate, again, the governor proposed, when he proposed the $470 per pupil proration, that the retirement rate also be increased. Again, that's a state program that all employees are required to participate in. So that's a large increase of $2.7 million. And then, as I mentioned, the FICA, or the FICA tax that we are required to pay, that's associated with the step changes, and then utility increases. Now normally utility increases would go up more, but we have been making energy improvement changes related to new boilers, new lighting fixtures, and more energy efficient doors and windows, which are helping us to reduce our energy costs from the general fund. And so we don't see utility increases increasing as much as we might anticipate. In total, our expenditures are expected to increase over next year by about $4.7 million. So what does that mean to us from a district perspective in terms of the budget? This slide is purposely indicated as draft because this is based on the governor's proposal, but that is just one piece of the puzzle or the budget process. The governor proposed the $470 per pupil proration as well as the increase in the retirement rate. But the House and the Senate will also have their version of the proposed budget, and then shortly here they will be coming together and deciding what budget is the budget that we will be using, that they will be using for next year that ultimately impacts us here at Huron Valley Schools. So it's marked draft because I do anticipate some changes between now and the next month or two. This shows, though, one column, which is the current year we're in, fiscal year 10-11, where we are short, and that will be covered by our fund equity, our fund balance for this year. Again, thinking back to the fact that we did already make $4.3 million to balance the 10-11 school year. However, when you look at the 11-12, which is the middle column, we are looking at a shortfall of $12.9 million. Again, that is taking the slides that I just previously talked about, the changes with revenue and the changes with expenditure, and those are very large variances. Unfortunately, less revenues, increased expenditures equates to a $12.9 million shortfall for our budget for the 11-12 school year. So that's a challenge that we're working on. It's why we're talking about this here, and we'll go forward with how do we balance that budget since we are required to have a balanced budget for next year. And I'm not really focusing on the 12-13 school year at this point, but I always put it out there to have 2 years of reference points so that people understand that when we're making decisions, financial decisions, we don't want to just look at the 1 year. We also need to think about the impact for the future years. And we are currently with a structural deficit, which means revenues are not keeping up with expenditures. In this case, when you're reducing revenues and you have expenditures slightly going up, you have your structural deficit. So the next slide takes that information, takes that $12.9 million shortfall and shows it in a slightly different perspective for people to understand. So this is taking it and showing it on a per pupil analysis. So of the $12.9 million, what does that mean on a per pupil? So we're anticipating that our blended per pupil count for next year will be 9,965 students. It's based on a winter count from this year and a fall count for next year, and we blend that together. And then when you look at that, you can see with the revenues of a foundation reduction, the loss of 150 students, the reduction in special education millage because of our taxable values in Oakland County, and the loss of some other areas, we're actually short our revenue on a per pupil basis of $732 per pupil. So that's pretty staggering when you're thinking that your revenue is actually going down for each student by $732. Similarly, the expenditures with all the pieces that I talked about, salaries and healthcare and retirement and utilities, we're looking at an increase of expenditures of $472 per per pupil. And then the last piece is the stimulus money, the federal stimulus money, or ARRA funds. And without that money, we're also seeing a shortfall. Together, we're looking at approximately $1,294 per pupil shortfall for next year. And that represents about 14% of our budget. So it gets to the point where those are our budget projections, as staggering as they may seem. But at this point, we are reaching out to our stakeholders and asking for suggestions. This form is a form that we have available on our website as well as available at our building sites for people to be able to fill out information, to share their ideas on what their suggestions are from looking differently as a district. With the limited funds, we need to look differently, and we're looking for suggestions on how we might do that. So what are areas that you would recommend that we look at and consider and prioritize when trying to balance a budget with a shortfall as large as I just discussed? So what are our next steps? Well, one thing is making sure the information that I've shared today is being shared with not just you that are listening now, but everyone else that needs to be a part of this process in our community. So we will be informing people of the budget process and gathering input using that form and other feedback mechanisms. From there, we're going to develop our recommendations to try to determine how do we best balance the budget with that shortfall. Then once we've done that and prioritized those recommendations, we'll discuss those budget recommendations with the impacted stakeholders, ultimately getting to the point of approving the budget. Prior to approving the budget, though, we will have a budget work session on May 23rd where we will talk about this process and how we got to this point and a little bit more history economically of what's going on in the state and what we're proposing for budget changes for next year. And then on June 9th, we're looking to approve the budget, a balanced budget for the fiscal year 11-12 school year. So those are the current steps of where we are in the budget process and where we are with our current budget projections. We do anticipate that some of the numbers will change as they normally do as the state makes changes to their budget piece, and that impacts us, but we will continue to keep you abreast of the information. So thank you for listening, and hopefully you will have some ideas to generate some thoughts on how we can go forward to approve our budget. Thank you.